Howdy, everybody. So we just finished talking about mobilization for war, how the U.S. mobilized at home, how we prepare for war, how we got troops and supplies and money and all the stuff we need to fight the war. Now we're going to kind of go back in time a couple years and talk about how we get into war and how that all plays out. So the war itself started kind of the first catalyst. So while Japan is invading China, the real catalyst for the true world war is starting in Europe. This is when we talked about this already a little bit. This is when Germany invaded Poland. So you have that non-aggression pact between Germany and Russia. So they split up Poland. That's when France and England declare war on Germany. What's going to happen is a new type of warfare that Germany is going to unleash, something called blitzkrieg, where they spread rapidly across France. And blitzkrieg translates roughly to lightning war, this very speedy, fast form of war. Now, the British very quickly tried to mobilize what's known as the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. So this is mobilizing an army quickly, sending it over to the continent, to France, to aid in their defense. About 152,000 soldiers were sent over, including about 500 aircraft from the Royal Air Force, the RAF. Now, the French had some pretty strong defenses. So if you notice that solid red line, it's known as the Maginot Line. This is a bunch of fortifications, obstacles, artillery, all this kind of stuff built into this big defensive line, thinking that Germany would find it impossible to cross this line. And in fact, Germany did find it difficult. So difficult that they said, we're not going to go there. We're not going to fight across this Maginot Line. We're going to bypass this line by invading France through Belgium. So we're just going to invade into Holland and Belgium, conquer those two very quickly, and then push into France, where it's much more lightly defended. And this was France's great error. So much so that their army was not able to mobilize, and the British Expeditionary Force plus the French army were unable to hold off. And this led to Dunkirk. If you've seen the movie that came out a couple years ago, that's what this is talking about, this massive run of French and British troops trying to escape off the continent before the Germans can trap them. And this is a massive run, so much so that the British mobilize every single ship they can, all the way from the biggest ships to the smallest of the merchant marines. So just your average kind of fishing boats, small boats, anything that could carry troops was mobilized, sent over to the northern coast of France to bring people back to England. And you do get some people out. They managed to get 224,000 British out and 139,000 French, as well as some Belgium soldiers back to England. This is when Vichy France gets set up, the occupied France. So the yellow is the German occupied portion of France. The blue zone down towards the bottom is the French free zone. Now, free is kind of a very loose term at this point in time. It's known as Vichy France. You see the capital city down there, Vichy. And basically, this is a cooperating government. They're working with the Germans. They're technically free, but they are working with the Germans. What's crazy is the French surrendered before their armies in the field had even been defeated. Some had retreated to England at Dunkirk, but others along the Maginot Line had not even fully been defeated. But they surrender nonetheless. And this is where Germany goes even further. They begin an air campaign known as the Blitz, or the Battle of Britain, trying to attack England and bomb them into submission. We touched on this earlier. Now, the British had a secret weapon that allowed them to know when the Germans were coming, where they were coming, and get their RAF planes up in the air to meet them before the German bombers or fighters could get over England. This is radar. So the British have this early technology. And this is going to be kind of like the home defense system. It's the way they defend the British coast from bombs. Now, on top of trying to bomb England into submission, the Germans, who excel at submarine warfare with their U-boats, are trying to sink all supplies and resources getting into England, particularly from the United States at this point. Now, the US has maintained neutrality up to this point in the war. So the early years where England is kind of isolated by itself with no real allies. But we initially start with what's called cash and carry, where if they come and pick up supplies they need, we'll sell them whatever they want. And eventually that is going to evolve, and we're going to go even further and turn it into that Lend-Lease program that we talked about last class or the class before. Now, this is when the United States becomes the arsenal of democracy, where we are supplying all of the Allied forces. We supply our own forces in the United States with 2 fronts in Pacific and in Europe. We supply the British, the remaining French troops that are still fighting, the Chinese, and the Russians. So we are supplying virtually everybody. We're sending resources to the whole Allied force, keeping it up and running. And this is the true power of the United States during World War II. While we are resourceful and good fighters, and we have, a good military size in front, it is our manufacturing that really sets us apart. Now, right around this time, you have the creation of what's called the Tripartite Pact. This is where we get the Axis powers coming together officially. So you have Japan, Italy, and Germany signing an alliance with each other to say, not so much that we're going to work together, but that they won't compete with each other or cause problems for each other. And that's where the big problem lies, is they never create a cohesive strategy to conquer, well, pretty much the world. Japan wants to conquer Asia. Italy wants to conquer basically anything that was part of the old Roman Empire. And Hitler and Germany wanted the rest of Europe and Russia. But nonetheless, they never really cooperated. The Allied powers, the United States, France, the remaining French forces, the Chinese, the Russians actually work together. They cooperate with a cohesive plan, and that's what sets them apart. Now, this is when Italy attacks, and much like we saw with World War I, Italy is a risk when it comes to the world wars. Italy was supposed to have a massive Mediterranean fleet that was very modern and powerful, and it would have been great, except they decided to focus their efforts on invading other countries, particularly in Northern Africa and down by Ethiopia. They had some initial successes, but very quickly they got bogged down, and they weren't doing very well, so they had to call in support from Germany. So Hitler sent German forces in, and this is going to tie up Hitler's much needed troops that should be fighting in Russia or in Europe or against Britain. Instead, they're going to be fighting in North Africa over desert, over what amounts to useless territory as far as Hitler and the German war effort is concerned. This is going to be the first of 2 major errors that Hitler is going to make. So you have this one, aiding the Italians, trying to support the Italians and prop them up. And the second one that we'll talk about at the end of this lecture. So another major error mistake made by Germany is in the midst of trying to help militarily support Italy, they decide to launch what's known as Operation Barbarossa, which is a massive invasion of Russia. They wanted to catch Stalin off guard and defeat Russia before the winter came. So they thought they were going to attack out of their Polish holdings, punch through the Soviet defenses, and captured Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad very quickly without much resistance. And initially, it does go fairly well. But the one problem that the Germans have facing off against the Russians is the Russians are resourceful, and they have lots and lots and lots of people. The Russians will stall the German advance basically by throwing bodies at the attack. And this is the fundamental problem. Now, we're also fighting in the Pacific as well. So by this point, Pearl Harbor's happened. They've brought us into the war, and we are beginning to fight on 2 fronts. Now, the U.S. is joining properly. We're going to start sending troops as well as supplies, and we're going to be fighting on 2 fronts. Now, what's even more interesting is there's a whole third theater of the war called the China-Burma-India theater, where we send troops and supplies to help kind of the British in India and Burma, as well as our Chinese allies, fight against the Japanese. Now, there's a group called Merrill's Marauders, and these are troops that fight kind of a guerrilla war against the Japanese, and they do very well in this theater, make a name for themselves fighting. They are famous for kind of deep penetrating missions that go well behind Japanese lines, often engaging Japanese forces far superior in number to their own, disrupting supply routes, really causing a nuisance to the Japanese out in this area. Now, the situation when the US finally joins. As you can see, everything in blue is controlled by the Axis powers. So things are very tenuous by this point in the war. Now, Russia is also begging for a second front to be opened. They are getting smashed by the German invasion, and they desperately want a second front open to kind of force Germany to have to fight on two separate sides. But right now, things are not going great for the Allies. But the US has arrived, and we're going to begin trying to do what we can. So we decide we'll kind of open a second front, and we're going to kind of practice invading using North Africa. Now, initially, this isn't going to go too well for the United States. Kind of our first major battle is the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and we, the United States, get smashed. It does not go well for us. In fact, the first time we face off against the Germans, we get up and run. We leave all our stuff, our weapons, our supplies, and we just run. We don't do very well. This whole Battle of Kasserine Pass is a huge disaster. What is interesting about this battle, what's telling about this battle, is allegedly one of the German generals, Rommel, goes and looks at the battlefield after the US is defeated and sees what the Americans left behind. And he makes a comment, apparently, and it said, if the Americans can leave this much stuff behind, they can just get up and leave it without any worry or fear, we've already lost the war. And what he's alluding to is the fact that the Germans were at their material limits. There was no more supplies or resources or manpower in Germany. However, the United States was just beginning to mobilize theirs. And this is what truly scared Rommel. The German general knew that we had the material advantage in the war, and this was going to give us a big advantage for the rest of the war. Now, you have something called the Atlantic Charter. This is the big four. The United States, Britain, Russia, and China all decided on a Germany-first approach. America will still be fighting in the Pacific. We're going to focus on Germany and try to knock them out of the war first. Now, at the Casablanca Conference in early 1943, the British and the Americans agreed to continue to press the initiative in the Mediterranean by invading Sicily. This was an attempt to kind of moderately open a second front, not a primary one, but a secondary front or a tertiary front in certain ways. While all this is happening, one of the biggest turning points in the war is going on. So you have the Casablanca Conference, which I just touched on, but you have the Battle of Stalingrad. So if you see the Soviet Union in purple, at the bottommost area of the purple, you see a red dot, and that's the city of Stalingrad. This is named after Stalin himself. And this is going to be probably the single biggest battle of the Russian front, of the kind of Russian invasion. Hitler wanted Stalingrad captured. It was Stalin's namesake city, and he wanted to capture it to send a point. Now, they were supposed to take it very quickly after the initial invasion, but winter set in, they bogged down, and this turns into a slow, slogging bloodbath. And this gets really bad. In the Battle of Stalingrad, more than 2 million Russians will die, while about 800,000 German soldiers will die. But Russian forces managed to overtake the German advance, and the German commander surrendered in February of 1943, resulting in a major reversal of the German attacks. By 1944, the Russians had driven the Germans out of Russian territory. And Stalingrad marks this turning point. Now, one of the interesting characters in this kind of narrative is Maria, and I'll let you read her last name, but her husband was killed in the Battle of Stalingrad. She sells everything she has, donates it to the war effort to build a tank. And she asks, the only thing I ask for is to be allowed to pilot that tank, to drive that tank. And she's given command of that tank. And she names it the Fighting Girlfriend. And she's actually going to fight her way across Russia and into Germany over the course of the war in kind of vengeance for her lost husband. Now, as Russia is pushing into Germany, this kind of slow crawl to Germany, the Allied forces, the British, the Americans, and the French are beginning to invade France, to retake France from the Germans. This is going to be known as D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord. This is going to be the single biggest invasion in world history. The Allied forces, led by Dwight D. Eisenhower as the overall Allied commander, is going to lead more than 1.5 million men in a single invasion of the German, or of the French, German control, but the French coastline at Normandy. Now, this is a massive invasion. If you watch Saving Private Ryan or any other kind of World War II D-Day movies or played any of the video games, you've seen scenes like this. Men landing on this battlefield, heavily contested in certain of the landing beaches. But it's not just the initial landing that's hard, which is brutal. And I'll post some links to videos that kind of show what the attack would have been like. But it's what came immediately after the initial invasion. We had to keep supplying troops. Once we landed the first wave of troops, took the beaches, we had to keep supplying them. So you have, and kind of see in this picture, you have massive ships designed to kind of beach themselves, open up their front, and unload troops, supplies, tanks. You can see the floating balloons in the background designed to serve as obstacles from low-flying planes if Germans tried to counterattack. And you have this massive logistical infrastructure trying to supply the troops that are currently invading deeper and deeper into France. You even have what are called mulberry harbors, which are these harbors made of sunken ships. They brought ships over from England, sunk them to create kind of an artificial barrier. And they create new harbors and piers to begin unloading supplies until actual harbor towns with ports could be captured. My grandfather was actually one of the ones that went in at D-Day. Kind of the day after the initial invasion, he was one of the ones that landed and ran logistics in the quartermaster department. So I had one grandfather fighting in the Pacific, another fighting in Europe. Interestingly enough, we talked about, with the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt going into war. You have Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. At D-Day, you had another Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who had to walk with a cane, actually landing at D-Day as well. So he's going to have his own role. So the Roosevelts are at the heart of American history and American warfare. Now we're going to talk about some important Americans fighting in Europe. So in this case, you have Margario Garcia. He had come to Texas from Mexico before World War II looking for a better life. He initially settled down in Sugar Land, just outside of Houston, as a cotton farmer. And when the war came, he volunteered to do his part. In November 1944, he had participated in D-Day, and he was in Germany leading a platoon against Germans who, when they found themselves pinned down by machine gun fire. Garcia then selflessly went ahead of his platoon and attacked the machine gun nests, went out and destroyed 2 enemy machine gun nests entirely on his own while wounded, killing 6 Germans and capturing 4 prisoners, all by himself while wounded. For his bravery, Garcia was given and awarded the Medal of Honor by Harry Truman. 1 month later, Garcia was in Houston and tried to eat at a local restaurant. The owner wouldn't serve Mexicans, so Garcia got into a fight with him and was arrested and later put on trial. So you have a war hero who has received the Medal of Honor from the president himself, not able to eat at a restaurant in Texas. So this is the weirdness of this late 1930s, early 1940s in World War II. You can have a Mexican-American war hero come home who's still treated like a second-class citizen. Now, he will become officially an American citizen in 1947. Another Texan is a guy named Audie Murphy. And he is going to be the single most decorated veteran of World War II. He was born in Hunt County, Texas, son of desperately poor sharecroppers. He dropped out of high school or dropped out of school in general in the 5th grade to take care of his family, to help work and raise money after his father abandoned their family. His mother died when he was 15, and he had to take care of his younger siblings, many of which he had to often put into orphanages just so they could get food while he raised enough money. Now, with the help of his younger sister, he helped alter and forge documents that make him look like he was 18 rather than 17 to help join the army. Now, he was first rejected by the Marines for being too small. He was only 5 foot 7 inches and 145 pounds. But later, he manages to get into the army. And during World War II, he found himself on the Eastern Front fighting the Germans. During a fight in southern France, Murphy's best friend went up to accept a German machine gun nest, surrendering after waving the white flag. Instead, the Germans killed him, and this sends Audie Murphy into a rage. He single-handedly wiped out the German machine gun nest, killing those who had just killed his friend, and then proceeded to use the weapons from that machine gun nest to destroy several other German positions nearby. In another fight, he held off an entire German infantry position by himself for over an hour, killing a total of about 50 Germans during that time. That won him the Medal of Honor. Overall, he won every single medal the U.S. Army offers and could grant. 5 of them he won more than once. He had something like 33 medals in total, including ones from Belgium and France, who also gave him medals. Another prominent person from the war is Joe Medicine Crow. And he's going to be the last surviving war chief of the Crow Nation. Now, it takes some things to become a war chief. He had grown up on an Indian reservation near Lodge Grass, Montana. He attended college at various places and was working on his PhD with the outbreak of World War II. So he volunteers to go to war. Now, he's going to complete all 4 tasks that it takes to become a war chief. This is why he's one of the last surviving war chiefs of the Crow Nation. You have to touch an enemy without killing him, called counting coup. You have to take an enemy's weapon. You have to lead a successful war party, and you have to steal an enemy's horses. So he touched a living enemy soldier and disarmed him after turning around a corner, finding himself face to face with a young German soldier. He knocked his gun away and ended up letting the German go when the German soldier cried out for his mother, thus stealing a weapon and counting coup. He also led a successful war party, which stole 50 horses owned by the Nazi SS from a German camp, singing a traditional Crow honor song as he rode off. He received the Bronze Star Medal and the Legion d'Honneur for his service in World War II. In 2009, shortly before his death, President Obama gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, the 141st Infantry, the Texas Battalion, had been fighting in northern France. And they got bogged down, they got isolated, and it's going to be another group that's going to fight to help free them. It's going to be those Nisei troops, those Japanese-American troops that were part of the most decorated division or the most decorated unit in the U.S. Army. So you have white Texans being liberated and saved by Japanese Americans that were fighting for their nation, while that same nation had their own family interred in camps. So they took heavy casualties to do it, but they managed to save the Texas Battalion, also known as the Lost Battalion. Now, back in Europe, you're going to have kind of the last big push by the Germans. So the Germans are going to fight what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. This is their last big push out, trying to punch away to get to the French coastline and split and capture many of the Allied forces. And while you do, as you can see on the picture, you have this little bulge that comes out, that solid red line. But it eventually gets pushed back by Allied forces, and the city of Bastogne, which was isolated and surrounded by German troops, will be liberated, saving the U.S. troops there. But this is going to be a hard-won fight. It's going to take several weeks that pass in the heart of winter that American troops will be isolated, starving, running low on ammunition, barely holding off the Germans. But they managed to push the Germans back, And this begins what's known as the race to Berlin. This is when Allied forces in France are pushing towards Berlin and Russian forces. The Soviet Union is pushing towards Berlin as well. And it's a race to see who gets to the city first, because that's going to be the big prize, to capture the enemy city. However, Eisenhower, the Allied commander in Europe, so of all Allied forces excluding the Russians, he decides we're going to let the Russians get there first. We'll let them do the hardest of fighting, take the heavier casualties, and then we'll go in and help clean up. So we make this very clear decision. Not all the generals in the US Army agree. Patton, one of the most famous generals, is going to say, nope, we're going to get there first. And he and his armored division of tanks is going to run up and try to race to beat the Russians on the way up. However, he outruns his supply lines, and his tanks will be sitting ducks. Thankfully, there was no major fight, despite the fact they had run out of gas. So Patton is going to get into a lot of trouble for this. But in Berlin, the Germans are running out of troops. They start equipping children and old men to defend Berlin. And Berlin is going to be bombed into submission. And once the armies, the Russians, and then later the Allied forces with the British and the French arrive, slowly capturing Berlin. You can see the Brandenburg gates all but burned out. Russians flying their flag over the captured city. You can see US troops having captured a Nazi flag. Then you have Hitler's bunker, his isolated defensive position under Berlin. Now, Hitler does not apparently believe in the adage of the captain going down with the ship, to fight to the very end. Instead, he and his girlfriend, fiance, wife, Eva Braun, decide the best course of action is to poison their dogs and then take poison themselves. So they end up committing suicide. Hitler bails on his entire war. The big war he started, he could not handle the thought of loss, so he commits suicide, so he doesn't have to face the consequences of losing the war. But thankfully, the war is over in Europe, and now the war begins to turn to Asia in a new and more focused effort. However, there's one more factor. This is the second big flaw of Hitler's plan to win the war, is being uncovered as the Russians start going into Poland. As the Americans start going into Germany, they start finding something. While we're celebrating the end of the war, news starts flooding in of these massive prison camps and execution camps being found all across Germany and Poland. These are the Holocaust concentration camps, the true horror of the war. Even when it looked like the Germans were going to lose the war, Hitler kept putting more and more resources behind the process of exterminating the Jews. He diverted troops, supplies, resources to kill Jews rather than fight the war. Now think about this. Millions of Jews are going to be killed during the war, many of which were Germans or Austrians that probably would have supported the war or would have at least participated in the war in some passive way had they not been persecuted and had they not been attacked and murdered. So this is the real flaw. We spend so much time and effort killing Jews rather than actually fighting the war. Hitler shot himself in the foot so many times during the war that this is truly crippling the nation. But the horror that goes on, this wasn't just a simple put them in camp, isolate them, get them out of sight. This was starving them to death, working them to death, torturing them, experimenting on them, all because they were slightly different from you. Hitler blamed the Jews for the loss of World War I because they were an easy scapegoat. We talked about this in the past, why Jews get targeted. But nonetheless, this is what is going to happen. And these are true atrocities. So the starvation, the people that are rescued, that actually make it through this horrific event, are all but dead. They're emaciated, they're malnourished, and it's going to take months for them to come back to full health. That's just the physical scars. The emotional and psychological scars take generations to heal. We're still healing from the horrors of the Holocaust today. So as the American troops begin liberating these camps, as the Russian troops begin liberating the camps, they have to take into consideration some of the horrors that they're seeing. And these are truly shocking images. People knew bad things were happening in Germany. We had rumors and knowledge that there was some sort of attack on the Jews going on, but the true extent is not really discovered till we go in and start liberating these camps, seeing just how many people were actually killed. They were burned alive in ovens. They were killed in gas chambers. You can see here wedding rings of all those that were killed, taken from men and women, melted down and sold to help fund the Nazi war effort. Gold fillings in teeth were taken from the pits after people were burned. Some of the worst camps, like Auschwitz, you have massive gas chambers. You can see the clawing at the walls of people dying slowly, painfully. Now, it's hard to believe that the German people living near these camps did not know what was happening. Trainloads of people were arriving, and no one was ever leaving. Many claimed ignorance. Some may have been ignorant, but one of the interesting things is US soldiers had these Germans go, all these German citizens that claimed ignorance, go and actually help move the bodies, help bury the Jews that their government had killed. Now, some of these Germans may not have wanted Jews to be killed, but they might have been scared of the Nazi policies, don't want to oppose the ruling government for fear of reprisals. Some of them may have supported it. It's hard to really know what's inside the hearts of individual Germans. But nonetheless, Germany today has made a point saying you cannot deny the Holocaust. We have to remember what happened, what Germany did, in order to prevent it from happening in the future. And we'll stop there, and we'll pick up next lecture, or the other half of this lecture, with the war in the Pacific.